The latest ArtNet intelligence report is out, and we're now taking it live. On April 8th, Editor-in-Chief Naomi Ray joins award-winning senior reporter Katia Kazakina for a virtual conversation unpacking the report's key findings. Tap the link in the show notes to reserve your spot.
I have to say my first vibe about it was that it's like giving zombie Twombly. Ben, I'm sure
you have to
I know you remember.
I don't know what that is.
Yeah, okay.
It's a deep art reporter term right there. I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. Spring is upon us. March has seen a burst of big art events, the true start of a busy year. And we've picked out a few of its big topics to talk about. In this episode, we will be talking about the 2026 Whitney Biennial, which opened at the beginning of the month. It always gives a snapshot of who's in and who's out and what's on curators' minds. We'll be talking about the rise of a new art historical art star, the Flemish Baroque painter Michelina Wier. And then we'll talk about a new investigation that claims to definitively, absolutely, positively, once and for all, settle the question of who Banksy really is. Do we think they did it? Does it matter? With me to talk is Kate Brown, ArtNet senior editor and Art Angle co-host in Berlin as usual.
Hi, Ben.
And here in New York with me is Eileen Kinsella, senior market editor.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for having me.
So to get things going, let's talk a little bit about art we've seen before we get into the big topics. Eileen, you're our special guest today. What have you seen lately in art?
I went to the Outsider Art Fair, which I know is like its own sort of institution in New York. It's been running for a long time. I have to be honest and admit, I don't always get there and get to see it, but I made a point to go to the opening day on Thursday, and I caught the work of an outsider artist named Sam Doyle, who's from a remote island in South Carolina known as St. Helena, and it's a community called Gullah. They were descended from African-Americans who were enslaved, and this guy, he was such an interesting character. He just kind of picked up a paintbrush on his own using house paint, would paint on found materials like wood, and do all these portraits. So over the years, he's actually been known since the 80s. He does these very engaging portraits. He actually caught the eye of Jean-Michel Basquiat and ended up in some really famous collections like Andy Warhol and Fab Five Freddy and some museums. But he's getting a really closer look now and had a solo show at the Gallery of Everything from London.
That's fascinating. I've never actually heard of this artist, I'm ashamed to say. What does the work look like specifically?
Very raw sort of portraits. The owner of the Gallery of Everything, who was showing the work, said to me, and I totally identified with this, was that he put celebrities like Jackie Robinson and Ray Charles on the same level as he did like the local undertaker or the local root doctor who would like issue powders and hexes and things like that. So very colorful depictions of the locals and some like really big figures in society at the time. He passed away in the mid-1980s, but I'm happy that, he wasn't completely unknown. He got some attention during his lifetime, clearly with the Basquiat recognition, and had a solo booth, really beautiful, well-laid booth. It was great. So there was one portrait I focused on in particular was the root doctor that I mentioned.
Cool. I feel like a lot of our colleagues really resonate with what's on view at the Outsider Art Fair. It's so many fascinating stories come out of that fair. So hopefully we'll make it one day.
Very true, yeah.
Fairly often considered one of the best art fairs in New York, or at least the most enjoyable or revelatory, if you want to put it like that. I guess that might be a little bit of a cliche when it comes to outsider art. But in any case, people like the fair. Kate, what about you in Berlin? Anything interesting? Anything worth reporting?
Well, I just a couple weekends ago was at the Hamburger Bahnhof, which is this contemporary art museum in Berlin's first ever gala, which was quite interesting. There was an artwork there that I thought I might mention. It was kind of hilarious. It was an Elm Green and Drag set piece. They're a duo that's based here. And it was called Performing Yourself. And basically, The gala started, 500 of these like VIPs that had been invited or purchased, expensive seats had sat down. And then this curtain fell back and revealed a second audience watching them. And they proceeded to sit there and basically just watch us for the rest of the night. And it was really amazing. And like maybe like a couple dozen people in this like mini theater. Some of them were dressed up like gala wear. Some of them were just, sitting there chatting with each other. Like occasionally you'd see one get up and go to the bathroom. Pipilotti Rist went over at one point and tried to offer someone some cake. They said, no, thank you. It was such a great piece of art to kind of create this self-awareness of the performativity of these events. Anyway, and then at one point when the main course came, which was like at 10 p.m. or something, because it was, a slow evening, they just did a standing ovation and applauded for everybody. And then they like wandered off into the night themselves. It was an incredible work.
Oh, amazing. I like Elm Green and Drag Set. They're a duo. They're hard to classify in terms of medium, but they have a very good eye for I don't know if you wanted to be uncharitable, you call it stunt art or something like this, but it's an art that creates some kind of social situation that creates like a moment to talk about.
Yeah, it's quite witty often, and a little bit sentimental, but it's really like crowd pleaser and it does work. Like I think they're good artists.
They have this monument to Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid that is just a statue of it, and then it just blinks once every so often, very subtly. So I have to give people an idea of what I'm talking about. I mean, it looks like one thing, and if you stick around, there's this very subtle thing that happens it's half joke and half, I don't know, paranoia will make you second guess what you're seeing.
Yeah, they also had a work at Frieze London last year that was an inversion of this audience piece. And basically it was like there was a video work and you walked in and looked at this theater again, but then you were kind of staring at it because there was a bunch of wax figures. And every once in a while, like you realize that there was just a visitor there watching the video that they were watching. So you realize you were just like staring at some person. Anyway, they're good at social estrangement. But what have you been seeing? What have you been up to, Ben? You've been writing quite a few reviews of all these shows opening in New York.
Oh, yeah. Well, like I said, March, is
March Madness.
Tiring me out already. Yeah, it's March Madness in art. The big event, like the major event in the New York art world right now is that the new museum has opened its new building. And I guess we talked about that a little in last week's episode when we interviewed Christopher Calendron-Thomas, but I got a chance to see their opening show, which is called New Humans, Memories of the Future, and wrote a review of it. I think it's a great show. I mean, I think people are going to really like it. The architecture press is still weighing in on the new building, which is by OMA, Rem Koolhaas's firm. But in terms of my piece of the coverage, which is looking at this show, which mixes the old and the new in a very interesting way. I thought the show was really memorable. I think people should check it out. It's a real event show.
In your piece, I was really interested in how you say that it signals in some ways the end of the contemporary and this kind of turn back to modernism.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's sort of grandiose title to my piece, which is, the long, slow death of contemporary art or something like that. Well, I guess I really thought that the show would be really about future shock or the present. I mean, it had a theme about artists engaging with technology and figuring out, new ways to be through technology. And there's so much technological anxiety on people's minds right now because of artificial intelligence and a whole host of other things. So that seemed very of the moment and right for the new museum. But that's not really what the show is. I mean, Massimiliano Gioni, for folks who don't know, who's the lead curator of this show and the curator associated with the new museum, has become known for this very specific style of curating, cabinet of curiosity curating, where you have like cutting edge contemporary art or famous contemporary artists, and then mixed with older art and curiosities. Like, it's hard to call it anything other than that. Like, in this show, there are these drawings of neurons from the brain by an early brain scientist. And there are some of the first images of pictures ever taken of the fetus. So it really looks to the past. There's also just a lot of modern art in it. So I just think, I guess, to make a complex thesis and to compress it down to a little bit, I do think there's a lot of anxiety about the digital right now. I think it's very notable that the new museum is this institution that was, when it was founded in 1977, a new kind of institution that was all about thinking about what was now, what was contemporary, what was experimental now, and then now I think it's just very difficult for a physical institution to move fast as the digital, and I think this, by their own description, this show, this way of seeing things, which mixes the past and the present, is somehow very digital. Like that's how history appears to you, is all mashed up online. But also, it's just not a show that's really about digital art at all. It's really running away from that and trying to find different things to do that feel very physical, tangible, look back to the past, make you feel like you're in a space. I just think that's a very notable thing. I think art is in one sense running away from the digital right now as fast as it can because it has its own version of anxiety about digital culture that, affects all of us.
It's interesting, like seeking a kind of friction in a very frictionless moment. But that's maybe an interesting pivot point because from what I've been reading, the Whitney Biennial is quite different. Lots of people have been saying it's moody. It also has no title. So maybe we should move on to talk about that exhibition. The 82nd Whitney Biennial, which opened in March and runs through August 23rd, the Whitney Museum, which is in New York. And there's 56 artists, duos, and collectives. And it's curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer. And both of you guys went to it. So I'm curious, you've had some time to digest it now. What's your big take? And maybe we can start with the fact that the show doesn't even have a title. Like it's really got this loose thematic, right?
Yeah. Ben, I love both of your reviews. And I especially love the second one because the first thing I thought when I walked in and I walked around, and I'll talk more about it, was that I like it. I'm really interested, but I got to come back. I got to come back another day, spend a lot more time. The first takes are great that the whole ArtNet team did, but there's so much to think about. I, for one, particularly enjoyed this year the lack of a title because I found myself in editions past trying to fit everything that I saw into the theme of the title and wondering sort of like how it relates. And sometimes that just wasn't successful. And so this time when I walked in, I felt like I had an open mind. There's so much great stuff, but it's also so thought-provoking without like making my brain think too much. I just sort of was taking it in. And, you mentioned this focus on the digital at the new museum. I felt like there was a very big emphasis on the handmade, a lot of found objects, things that were sort of thought-provoking on their own. I can get more into like myself and Sarah and Bill, who we all saw it together, and Ben, you were there, our first takes. But yeah, my first take was that I really enjoyed kind of taking it all in and not trying to cram it into some category in my brain.
Yeah, I think the lack of the title, sort of the dog that didn't bark in the night or whatever, is interesting. I did a little earlier a piece about looking at the Whitney Biennial, Greater New York, and the Carnegie International. Those last two shows are opening later this year. Just looking at the artists in them, trying to think about common themes between them. And I do think there is a real retreat from labels. I mean, I do think, to be fair to the curators, I do think, a title just gives the critics like a big juicy target to hit, to beat up on,
Maybe, yeah.
But I mean, I think that in a way that's sort of significant. I really do think there's this sense, maybe this is just my own headspace as an online writer, but I do think there is a sense of just being bombarded by information and takes. And you even see that in just how fast the takes come in around a show now. These curators work for 2 years to curate a show, and then people are there, and you have 2 hours of the press preview, and the opinions are kind of already hardening. And I almost feel like the not having a title was like a retreat from defining it too much in advance, so that it just like forces you to kind of like find your own way through it.
That reminds me of how the Berlin Biennial, I think it was the last year, that they didn't release the artist list until the day before the opening. There were multiple reasons for that, I think, given the political situation here, but also was maybe to not let people get too organized in their kind of opinions before they went in. Another thing that really interested me when I was reading reviews about that show was how few artists are talking about America in specific. And it is really like an American biennial. What was your guys' take on that?
One thing that myself and my colleagues talked about when we just had a moment to kind of recap was how broad the definition of an American artist is. You know, it's supposedly the Biennial of American Art. And I don't know if this had ever happened before. I think maybe it didn't, but they also had labels for people that lived in areas that were like occupied by America at some point. Like there was a reference to Okinawa and like post World War II American occupation, which this is another thing that happens when you're reading things. Sometimes you're reading labels and things strike you. And Ben, I don't know if this happens to you. My immediate reaction for myself is like, oh, I didn't know that. I probably should have known that. And I didn't know that. Then I talk with other colleagues and it's like, oh no, that was a standout, the noteworthy thing. And that was sort of my reaction to some of the descriptions of the artists, who they are, why they might be linked to America, whether they were born here and then moved abroad or, you know, vice versa. And to me, that felt like a kind of a widening of the definition of who can be in this biennial.
I think that's true. I think that's a little bit part of the pitch of this show. Obviously, it's a time of great anxiety about America. But at the same time, I personally feel like this is almost a cliche of the Whitney Biennial that they've been like, I feel like the first one I went to, which was like in 2006 during the Iraq War, they were talking about the need to rethink American identity. And, you know, the last one had artists from Mongolia in it and Isaac Julian, who's a British artist. And I mean, I think that they're always trying to expand and toy with this idea and come up with a way to try and not make sure the American artist identity is too confining to them. I mean, I do have a suspicion that I said in my second follow-up piece, which is that despite the fact that it's very non-American centered, the other way you could look at that, if you were being ungenerous, is that look, the art world is just a coastal phenomenon and is much.
Yeah.
It is like the knock on liberals from like your Steve Bannon types is that like a liberal in New York is much more connected to people in London or Berlin than they are to people in, Cleveland or Iowa. And there is like very scant representation for the middle of the country in this show, whereas at least 4 of the artists in this show live in Berlin, where you live, Kate.
Yeah, that's interesting. So can you say a bit more about like what was on view and what it looked like? Because, I know that they were leading with this idea of mood and texture as sort of the driving idea.
One of the most like recognizable features, because it's one of the first thing that you see. And Bill, my colleague, called it the poster child. He compared it to the poster child of the previous biennial, was these dog toys. And it's by this artist, Amélie Louise Gassio, called Kong Play. He said that it may initially read as whimsical, but it's actually like an elegy, and how it moved him because it was so much about the depth of the relationship between a human and their service dog, including drawings showing them both as like bipeds. And again, it was just very, to me, kind of like about a found object and very direct drawings that reference that. And that was a little surprising to be the first introduction to the show. And it felt very simple and very direct and emotional. And I felt like I saw a lot of that throughout the show.
Yeah, on the next floor, on the floor above that, there's an installation by Michelle Lopez, which is what introduces you to that floor, called Pandemonium, which is essentially a film on the ceiling that puts you inside a tornado or a vortex, where it's just all these swirling documents and papers and American flags. And the message is pretty obvious. It's about America coming apart, about being inside of an America that is just being blown apart. But the 2 notable things are, it's about making you feel that. I mean, there's not a subtle message. It's just like, that's on the surface. And then here we're going to try and like create a thing that translates that into a feeling. It's almost like a manifesto about that particular move. And then the second thing is just, because it's all these documents blowing around, it really does seem to be about, the bombardment of like I said, takes and, information moving around. And a lot of this focus on mood seems to me like to be trying to extract the art from this. I mean, to me, and this was true of the last biennial too, and a few past, there's just this kind of like low-level paranoia or just sense of like real fragile subjectivity. Like a lot of the art seems really small and like has lots of little like bits of things that are like charged with some kind of personal meaning, but doesn't quite disclose that. When they say mood, I really think they mean this kind of retracted or retreated subjectivity that a lot of things are about that seems kind of wounded by the state of the world, the state of communication, the state of having to perform yourself as an artist and all that.
Yeah, the fact that you flagged that was a great work that really captured my attention. I walked in and it has that very haunting, urgent, dystopian soundtrack to it. That violin, I'm not sure exactly what it is. I'm sure I could nail it down if I looked. And just watching all these papers flying around and kind of like almost hitting you in the face, even though they're from the ceiling. I thought everything about that installation was jarring, but fascinating and also so true. And is a prime example of another one that I'm like, I got to go back and sit with that one for like probably another good stretch of time to analyze what the messages are that are blowing at you, and also just that sense of urgency and paranoia that it imparts.
It's interesting that like gentleness and like sidelong feeling to the work that you guys described. Like, do you think the show takes enough risks? You know, it is a really high stakes moment.
Yeah, and I mean,
America.
It's such a hard question because I think, yeah, like the last one, I think there's a kind of I can't go on, I must go on kind of energy to it where it's like,
yeah.
I now is the time to say something important. We need to like have some sense of urgency or really make the case for art in this context. But at the same time, like, I don't want that burden. I don't want to have to like speak my personal truth against this background. I mean, that's how I read a lot of this as a sort of a compromise or trying to find a way between those. And I think the curators, to give them credit, I think are trying to push in that direction. They're trying to find something that feels like a little bit risky. It's very, in my opinion, sort of cautious. But I think of this video by a filmmaker named Jordan Strafer called Talk Show, which I sat through a couple times in the show. It's very hard to describe. It's very David Lynchian. And I say that because David Lynch specifically is a filmmaker who says, don't interpret my work in terms of meaning. And that is very much to the vibe of this show. He's like, the ideas come, you don't interpret the ideas, you just put them out there. And this video Talk Show is this very disturbing, weird, historical nightmare of some kind where there is what seems to be some sort of demonic, haunted memory talk show where men dressed as I think soldiers, as some sort of U.S. military figures, are brought on in a talk show format to talk with women that they have sexually assaulted, and the women are kind of showing their scars. It's very unsettling, and it doesn't like reduce to some kind of neat little like lesson about this. It just is like, this is a kind of poisonous bit of American culture that's out there that very much unsettles you because you don't know exactly what's going on.
Yeah. I had a kind of similar reaction to Cooper Jacoby, the work called Estate. I just found myself asking so many questions to myself. I'll tell you, the description of the work is it's sculptures that look like door intercoms, and they're fitted with cameras that kind of look around their environment. The thing I found most curious was the reactive AI models, the reactive and artificial intelligence models that were trained on social media posts from people who formerly worked in creative industries but are no longer alive. And like the legal reporter aspect of my brain was like, well, did he get permission to do that? How did he identify that? And then there was another aspect of it where they were talking about how they have LED screen counters that track the time since the death of the respective people down to the minute. Ben, I feel like that fits exactly with what you just said about the talk show video, which I also saw, which is like, there wasn't, to me, like a takeaway. It wasn't saying like, oh, you know, you should think this or you should know this. It was just like maybe some thought-provoking statements trained on AI models about, I don't know what they were observing, or the fact of like, there was such an emphasis on that they were creative people, that they were artists. So they must think a certain way. Is that antithetical to AI? Is that something thought-provoking to take away? Like, I agree with you that there weren't necessarily reductive lessons throughout. It was just a lot of kind of, let me think more about this.
Yeah, it's a thinky show. It's a thoughtful show. And And I think that Cooper Jacoby work, yeah, it's a provocation, I imagine. The fact that they don't have like a neat little explanation. This is why you don't need to be worried about his use of AI. And I guess, it's this provocative subject. I mean, people are really freaked out, panicked about AI. It's an alarming moment. So it maybe captures some of that just in its refusal to nail itself down. We should probably move on. Before we do you have a letter grade, Eileen?
Gosh, you know I'm not a critic. I would say B plus. I've seen a lot of Whitney Biennials, and I enjoyed this one a lot.
Yeah, I give it something like that, a B. A passing grade. Feels a little cautious, but I like the direction it's going. Yeah. Well, moving on to a totally different temporality, time period, but another thing going on in art history is an interest in old masters, as we talked about last time. And Eileen, you have a story about this artist who, I guess, is a sort of new star in the old master world. And that's very interesting.
Yeah. Her name is Michelina Wier, and I've been hearing her name a little bit for the past few years. She is now the subject of a major traveling retrospective. It was in Vienna at the, Kate, you're probably going to have to help me out. Is it Kunsthistorisches?
The Kunsthistorisches Museum, yeah. Art history is the direct translation.
It's coming to the Royal Academy in London very soon on March 27th, which I think is going to give it even more attention. But she's an amazing painter. Not a lot is known about her up to her birth date, which people have argued about and they weren't sure about. But generally now it's accepted as 1614. She's a Flemish Baroque painter. And she did a lot of portraits, and unusually for a woman, she also kind of broadened out beyond that and did like kind of these scenes of like allegorical, historical scenes that a lot of women painters, they wouldn't ever go beyond portraiture. And she's been getting a lot of attention. So we did a deep dive into her in one of our recent appraisal columns and just saw, some of these works that have been coming to auction. The thing I find interesting, and Kate, I noticed this also in your story, is like, a lot of these women painters were either mistaken for men or maybe mistaken for other more popular women like Artemisia Gentileschi. And when I was talking with one of the people from Christie's, she was just saying like this beautiful portrait of a head of a boy. And she was using these superlatives. And then when I saw it, it hit me. It's just this gorgeous portrait of a boy who's looking to his side. It's rendered so beautifully. His face and his skin are like so realistic. I think it's something that really probably deserves to be seen in person. And Ben, I think you mentioned you saw the show in Vienna.
No, I didn't see the show in Vienna, but I went to the Kunsthistoric Museum a few years ago, and just cold was really struck by this painting, The Triumph of Bacchus. It stopped me. It wasn't part of a show focusing on her. It just stopped me. For people who don't know, it's a big scene of debauchery with a Bacchus figure at the middle who is being, fed grapes. And then off to the side, almost like spotlit, in a way, is a woman with one breast bared who's staring dead out at the viewer. And then the label informed me that is supposedly a self-portrait by the artist, which is just very striking. It's just such a gesture of confidence and the painting itself is very, it's very lively. So it really stuck with me.
Yeah. I should mention, I was at TFOF in Maastricht a little while ago, and there was a painting by her also of a young boy looking off to the side. And I mean, it was a small painting, it was under 2 feet by 2 feet. But so the emotions that I think that she is able to capture are so specifically poignant. So anyway, I was kind of drawn into this. And then I was talking to the person at the gallery, and this director was saying, I have a PhD in Flemish art, and I did not hear about this person until 2018. As this person was saying this, like their face was looking gobsmacked, and I think that draws home the point of just how recent of a star she is. And we cannot not mention the backbone of all of these rediscoveries has been often female art historians and female art critics who have been doing the research and the scholarly work to frame these artists within the canon and also like discover them. And Katlina van der Stingelen, a Belgian art historian, she was the one who discovered her in the back vaults of the Kunsthistorisches Museum, and it was an unattributed work. Is that right at the time?
Yeah. Well, I think some people thought it was by Artemisia Gentileschi.
Right. And I should say this was back in the 1990s, but then it took more than a decade or two, basically, to get this artist of the first museum show, which happened in 2018. And so that was when, the rest of the art world, especially the art world that is very much invested in, Flemish painting, it just introduced her. And then ever since then, I mean, Eileen, I'm curious, because that was really when her market started to grow, right? It was right after that in 2019 that the first records came.
Yeah. And even then, I mean, when I talk to some of the auction experts, they say like the estimates that they put on works at the time, and they went far over estimate, they might rethink them now. And one of the ones I found so interesting. So there was a still life of flowers that sold for $18,000 in 1993. And then it came back up for auction in 2019. It had a different sort of more dramatic name on it. And when it sold again in 2019, it sold for $470,000, which is,
quite the upside.
Amazing uptick. And, yeah. And there were so many interesting aspects of her life, too, that it was almost the gaps that I found so telling about how women artists were viewed at the time. She apparently at one point went and moved to another city. She moved to Brussels with her brother. And so there's this misconception a lot of times when her works are viewed. For a long time, a lot of the works that people saw, they were attributed to her brother. And I think that just speaks to the fact that people look at something and think oh, that's not by a woman. As I understand it, when the curator first saw the works in the basement of the museum, they thought it was by a man until they sussed it out and figured out it was by her.
And started painting at 39, I wanted to mention. I thought that was a fascinating fact.
It's never too late, artists. Never too late.
Exactly. Well, exactly. I mean, and quite a painter. Although doesn't have a lot of works out there from what I understand. I guess what I wanted to ask both of you, since you were at TFAF, Kate, where everyone was talking about female old masters, you mentioned the map of women artists. It's apparently something people put out with this fair. And Eileen, since you did the reporting on Michelina, there are a lot of gaps in her backstory. I gather you don't know very much. It's just really just a few things. I mean, not more than you could fill a wall label with. So I guess I just wondered, because the story of, for example, Artemisia Gentileschi, her personal story is so much part of the artistic mythology around that. And the female old masters market really is powered by, in often case, women collectors looking for stories to connect with in the past. Is that a problem? Not knowing anything about the artist? I mean, I know we'd like to say that we judge it on just the quality of the work, but I do feel like people like a good story. Is it a problem that they don't have her story?
I was talking with Robert Simon, who's a very well-recognized old master dealer. And he said, flat out, he was just, when he first saw the work, he was just wowed by what a terrific painter that she was. He was just blown away by how good the work was. And it's almost secondary, because there could be just differences in quality. But I was also talking to another advisor who was talking about the general revisiting of work of women artists throughout historic periods. And she said, we know that women played key roles in the making of and the business of art for centuries, but much of that has come down to us anonymously or incorrectly attributed to men. So I think, embracing the story to me is a positive, and it's encouraging, because it's just a curiosity about knowing more about it. And if the work is good, it's going to stand on its own. It's just sort of broadening the picture and the appreciation that we have of it.
Yeah, and I would just also, on shouting things out, I mean, I think that there's a big amount of work that also gets done by the galleries, having to reattribute these works and do the scholarly research where there is none. And I think about, in the case of Wautier, there's about what they think about 40 works that they know are by her, but there could be more. That's the amount of work that Vermeer made, but I think that his life is so much better documented, so they can be relatively sure that the number is not much more than that. But for Wautier, I wouldn't be surprised if they find more of these. But again, to kind of confirm, and again, I'm speaking out of my expertise here, but to confirm attribution without catalogue raisonnés and documentation and letters and all these kinds of things that a lot of artists from that era have in archives is going to be very difficult. And I think that's a big problem for that era of women artists, of old master female artists. And to that note, something that I noticed when I was at TFAF, which is, a fair that focuses a lot on antiquities and old masters paintings, is this a kind of expanded view of what is important because collections want to expand their perspective. And so they're not only collecting now work that is by women artists in an attempt to do that, but also work that speaks to the lives of women at the time, which I think is a really important new angle. Of course, there's also, it helps with the supply issue if you can expand the definition of what constitutes like bringing in women artists.
Talking about issues of whether we have the full story of an artist, we should probably move briefly on to our final item, which is about maybe the world's most famous unknown artist, which is Banksy. So I'll introduce that item, which is just keyed for us to the fact that the Reuters published this very long 8,000-word piece, basically claiming to definitively unmask who Banksy was. And this sort of didn't even register almost as a story to me. I feel like we've known who he was for a really long time. We've talked about that before on this podcast, but has touched up a ton of media interest. What did you two think about this story?
Wait, but who is Banksy? We got to, in case somebody doesn't know.
Well, it's Robin Gunningham. As 2 decades ago, there's some investigation by British painters that said it was Robin Gunningham, and they used some kind of criminal profiling technology to confirm it was Robin Gunningham. Another paper did. The real development of this story, I think, is that through tracking down old police reports and basically a little bit of journalism, they figured out how he gets away with it, which is that he changed his name legally to the name David Jones. So they basically unmasked his alias that allows him to work in anonymity. It all starts from a trip he made to Ukraine during the war to do some stencils there, which he turned into a fundraiser to support ambulances in the war zone, which he will no longer be able to do because they've explained exactly who he is and how he gets away with it in this story.
What do you make of it, Eileen?
I have to say my first vibe about it was that it's like giving zombie Twombly. Ben, I'm sure
you have to
I know
explain
you remember.
I don't know what that is.
Yeah, okay.
It's a deep art reporter term right
there. So there was a tweet probably about like 10 or 15 years ago that said, Cy Twombly is dead. And it was years after he actually died, but people like picked it up and like ran with it and expressed, shock and grief or whatever. And it turned out he'd already been dead. And the whole point of it is like, he's already dead, but people saw the tweet and just like, treating it as real news. And I guess part of it is also like, people are not doing their due diligence, right? Like a lot of this is already known. So the joke became zombie Twombly, right? Like Cy Twombly, famous top-selling abstract expressionist artist who's been dead for a while, is now dead again, and people are taking it and running with it. And that was kind of what I thought when I saw the story. I just was like, they're promoting this as news and people are accepting it as news. But it also made me question, did we actually know who Banksy is? Because I know for years people have been like, he's been outed, he's not been outed, he's the lead singer or lead guy of Massive Attack. So I was sort of just like, am I missing something? Am I not missing something? Is it him? Is it not him? Hence my zombie Twombly reference.
I know that you were disappointed, Kate, that it turned out not to be the lead singer of Massive Attack, Robert Del Naja.
It would have been so cool.
But to be honest, it's pretty cool in anyways, in that it's a lot closer to it being him than I thought. I don't know, it's a stupid idea, but he is a street artist who goes by 3D. Banksy knows him and has actually said, I'm not as good an artist as 3D is. And apparently Robert Del Naja was on this trip to Ukraine for this UK street art campaign. So a lot of this article, because in the end, it's like you could sum up the news in this article in 2 sentences, keeps you in suspense that it might be the lead singer of Massive Attack who is Banksy.
Everyone can have their own truth on this one. It is this kind of perpetual unmasking of Banksy is also feeds into the news cycle's need to just like have a reveal all the time. Like everyone just loves a sort of reveal moment. And I just found that the nothing burger of the Reuters reporting just is another piece of that because, I clicked the headline. I was out of office and I was like, oh, what's this? And then I was like, wait, I read this before.
I was surprised by how irritated I was by it. It was so officious and like trying to like just defend, and having spent so much reporting resources on this, like kind of like implying, at certain points, it's like, well, isn't it unfair that he hasn't been punished, while other people who do graffiti are, like almost like demanding that he be, that their reporting lead to him being, getting a harder punishment for making, basically political graffiti in support of civil disobedience and stuff like that, or protesters. So it leaves a totally bad taste in my mouth, this thing, particularly when it ends with them with a timeline of all the charity he's done. Like there is a kind of like attempt to kind of marshal all this, jealousy towards him because he's famous and, he's made a career out of these stunts and stuff, but he doesn't have to do any of the charity he does, and they go through, through the means of this masked identity that allows him to pull off these kind of remarkable stunts that delight people around the world. However you want to think about it as art, he's raised a ton of money for really good things, and then it's basically just like saying well, find a new way to do that. Sorry, or something like that. I guess. Live by the sword, die by the sword. You've attracted a lot of attention with this kind of anonymous identity. You expect people to get to the bottom of it. But I just feel like the whole tone of this article is really odd. Yeah. And I was glad. I've seen there's been some pushback, a lot of pushback. I saw The Guardian published a piece basically arguing against the tendency to unmask anonymous artists and compared Banksy to actually Elena Ferrante, the Italian novelist. There's a lot of controversy about the obsession with unmasking who she really was, even though she had decided that she just didn't want to be famous.
Right. I mean, in the case of Elena Ferrante, she wouldn't necessarily be charged with an international circuit of crimes if she was outed. I also wonder if there's sort of this willful suspended disbelief that maybe it's not Robin Gunningham because, law enforcement would then have to maybe do something about it. And kind of, I don't think anyone wants to.
Well, wouldn't that be the greatest Banksy stunt of all? If this whole thing, he's the puppet master behind the whole expose, and it's all just to throw people off. So that's what I choose to believe. And I think we should leave it there. Thank you so much, Eileen, for being on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Kate, thank you, too, for being here.
Great to chat with you both.
The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.